and hello everyone. Um, I have the honor and pleasure to talk about IPCC guidelines, which is not typically a topic that too many people get excited about, but I hope by the end of this presentation you'll agree that it's an important topic for those of us working on climate change and greenhouse gas emissions. The first point to make is I think you have to sort of accept the almost humor of it is that this new publication from the IPCC has to have the worst title anyone has ever come up with, at least in the field of climate change. And I mean, that is what you see on the screen. Actually, is the proper title. I mean, this is what happens when you give a bunch of scientists and engineers, some literary leeway. But it comes from the fact that we've had the IPCC 2006 guidelines for over a decade now, and the thought was, there's probably some things that need some updating in it, but the determination was that even though it was over a decade old, it wasn't really needing full replacement. And there's a variety of technical and political reasons why full replacement wasn't deemed appropriate. But there still was some understanding that there was some science that needed updating. And so this is with all the kind of formal bureaucratic aspects of how the IPCC does things, this is the title we got. Next slide. So before I jump into it, just a quick commercial to let you know where I'm coming from. GHG Management Institute, we're a nonprofit primarily based in the US, and we do technical capacity building and professional development, to put it simply, for carbon measurement and carbon accounting geeks, is the way I like to joke about it. But we train professional verifiers, we train compliance review teams for the Climate Change Convention, and that support the Kyoto Protocol, and we'll be supporting the Paris Agreement. We train and help countries develop the systems for reporting, but we also work with companies and consultants and academics on understanding the technical aspects of how to do this work. We never do it ourselves, but we help other people get better at doing it for themselves. Click. So this is just a little bit about some stats on us. We'll have the slides afterwards so you can catch up on some of the stuff, because there'll be several technical points I'll be getting to that you can look at later. But basically, we're operating in countries around the world. We have alumni in countries around the world, and a lot of these alumni are the experts producing inventories, greenhouse gas emission estimates in governments and in NGOs and other organizations, oftentimes for formal reporting requirements or regulatory or UN reporting requirements. Next slide. So now let's get to it. We're going to step back a little bit. Many of you will understand this, but some of it that haven't had as much experience working on greenhouse gas emissions data and developing the estimates and reporting it out, it's good to think about why you're doing it in the first place. And there's a lot of different reasons. Some combinations of them might be at play at any given effort. Why we would make the effort of collecting data and creating greenhouse gas emissions and removal estimates. Obviously, a key one that we focus on a lot is informing policy making. The big term of art now, obviously, is nationally determined contributions, and informing, how to set those, and then tracking that you're meeting them, and helping support the policies for that for implementation. scientific inquiry. A lot of times, scientists are using, satellites to try and come up with emissions data and taking atmospheric measurements. But a lot of their work depends on having emission estimates to feed into models, to feed into different studies. So inventory data is used for scientific purposes. It can be used for public relations purposes by companies, which we see a lot in terms of like sustainability reporting, carbon offset markets, and various voluntary reporting programs. The same methods that we're going to be talking about are basically translated into offset protocols and used for those situations, both compliant and voluntary. And then just other regulatory mechanisms, emissions trading and other kinds of policy, carbon taxes. So, but in all cases, we want reliable data with varying degrees of quality associated with that. And the basic, to be honest, regardless of kind of how you're using the data, kind of the fundamental methods that you're using to build those estimates are the same or very similar. Next slide. So getting to that point, we talk in the kind of environmental greenhouse gas accounting world about different accounting frameworks. Some of these you may be familiar with already. The IPCC guidelines that we're going to talk about today are specifically developed for national inventories, meaning that national defined as a geographic boundary encompassing the territory of a nation, and emissions within that boundary are counted and emissions outside that boundary are not. But there's lots of other ways you can do it. And the basic, like I mentioned before, the basic methods in the IPCC guidelines are applicable to any of these other kinds of accounting frameworks. One obviously of some relevance here is at the subnational level, which can be defined in lots of different ways, obviously, including state and provincial. You can also look at understanding the greenhouse gas emissions impacts of different sectoral policies, kind of different policies or programs. So drawing the boundary around a policy to see what, for example, a best rapid transit system, shift in terms of infrastructure might look like, and what are the emissions associated or emission reductions associated with that. You can look at, obviously, companies and entities is a major area that a lot of folks are working on. So corporate inventories, but you can do it at different levels. You can define it around business units, around a single person, looking at your own carbon footprint. Supply chains and value chains is another area that brings in life cycle accounting boundaries. Facilities, installations, which is the basis of a lot of regulatory systems and emissions trading systems, is you basically say this power plant or this industrial facility or whatnot is what I'm doing an inventory on. And then obviously projects, which are dominant in the offset credit space. All these are different ways of defining boundaries and different ways of thinking about boundaries, and what thinking about for those of you that have familiar with life cycle type nomenclature, consequential and attributional type of boundaries of different scales. But the point to be made here is that essentially the methodologies for quantifying emissions are scalable, and that's why the IPCC guidelines is so important, is because it actually all of these different scales, the protocols and tools, in large part draw on the technical work that is in the IPCC guidelines. Next slide. So why do we need guidelines? I mean, this is just, of course, you don't need to memorize this, but there are a lot of categories, a lot of different emission sources out there, with numerous different gases to keep track of. Each having their own sorts of emission, what we call emission pathways, and basically science behind them. So you need a lot of guidance to figure out how to accurately quantify all these different emission sources. I mean, basically, as you probably know, greenhouse gases come from just about everything we do in one form or another. So it can be a complex exercise to kind of just keep track of it all and make sure you've got the right methods and right data to do it all. Next slide. So one of the things to recognize is at least in the UN way of thinking, we have kind of, I don't want to say two inventories, but two references for guidance. One is the IPCC guidelines, which provides the technical guidance, and then the UNFCCC, sort of the political side, the negotiation side, has its own, not technical guidance, but reporting guidance that all kind of essentially just translates and just reaffirms what the IPCC says, but puts it in the framework of like what countries are expected to do. The way the IPCC guidelines is set up is essentially catering to that UN, that political need. And the key definitions to understand is we're only looking at anthropogenic emissions within the IPCC guidelines and removals. So that means you have to tie the causation of the emissions back to something that human beings are doing. So the simple way to think about it, obviously, natural sources. There's lots of natural sources of greenhouse gases out there. Obviously, there's respiration and decay, fluxes of CO2 that happen just from the seasonal cycles of biomass. There's leaks of methane from wetlands that occur naturally, and we would, we don't count those natural fluxes within an inventory. Although from a scientific standpoint, if you're doing, sometimes scientific modeling and you're trying to tie that to atmospheric measurements, you do care about those natural sources because that's that's obviously part of the background that you're seeing when you do atmospheric sampling and measurements. So, but here within the inventories, we're looking only at anthropogenic. That's the key thing to take home. We're only focusing on the direct greenhouse gases. So these are and what we call long-lived gases. So these are the ones that stay up in the atmosphere basically for a long time, do not decay. There's lots of different chemical species that can get emitted, black carbon and NOx and SO2 and other things that do have what we say radiative forcing implications, but they're short-lived. They do not accumulate in the atmosphere. So again, the IPCC guidelines focuses on these long-lived accumulating greenhouse gases. The other thing we do that within the IPCC is we focus on point estimates. So versus like what you might do in a scientific study where you give kind of a range and kind of give values, the guidelines are designed to produce point estimates. So one number for each emission or removal category. And then there is guidance and processes in there for understanding, quantifying uncertainties around that point estimate. But the key thing is it's unlike you might again think of in terms of a scientific study. In the end, we do want to produce a point estimate, and that makes sense when you think about the use of the data for potential compliance purposes in international treaties or other things. In the end, you need a number, kind of a most likely number that you can say either you've gone above some target or below some target, which is obviously useful for a lot of things that all of us work on. And then the last point is we are focused on, in the IPCC guidelines, on comparability, meaning that we want guidelines that are able to compare emissions data between countries. And that that principle can also apply obviously to the other accounting scales. And we also obviously care about the trend in emissions. So a lot of attention is paid to making sure the estimates have time series consistency. There's not statistical biases in the time series that would lead you to have show a trend that is not reliable. Next slide. So just a quick thing on what is the IPCC. You don't need to, it's not that important, but there are multiple parts of the IPCC. The one that many people are more familiar with because it gets in the news is what they call the assessment reports. So these are there's 3-volume assessment report on science, mitigation, and vulnerability adaptation. And those are the ones that, every whatever 5, 6, 7 years that a report comes out that gets in the news. There's another part of the IPCC called the Task Force on National Greenhouse Gas Inventories. That's the methodological portion of the IPCC. That produces these IPCC guidelines reports, and it's supported by a technical support unit based in Japan, and they also maintain this IPCC emission factor database, which is quite a useful resource that you can do queries and find different emission factors for different sources and gases. We'll give you a link to that later in the presentation. Next slide. So just a quick plug on history. The first guidelines were produced in 1994. I have a copy sitting on my shelf. It was the fancy version. It's like, basically kind of Xerox paper copy with a cheap kind of high school spiral binder on it. And but since then we've come a long way. The major guidelines that dominated for many years was the 1996 revised guidelines, which really effectively was the first guidelines most people started using. The 1994 guidelines was almost like a pilot practice round, and then it's been updated a couple times since then. The good practice update was somewhat similar to what we're talking about today, in that for sort of certain political and other reasons, we couldn't replace the 1996 entirely, but we sort of did, but we couldn't say we did. So we had the good practice guidance, which was supplemental to the 1996, but effectively really replaced it. And then the 2006 guidelines replaced the good practice soon afterwards. Again, all of this being done as science advances, as the methodology advances, and as our experience doing these inventories advanced. Next slide. So now we get to the 2019 refinement. Again, the conclusion was through the IPCC process that the 2006 guidelines were still good. The methodologies were sound. The basic, accounting framework and way we think about things was all sound. None of that really needed changing. But there are nitpicky little things here and there in the guidelines that there's like some new studies on emission factor or some conversion factor, or a case point we'll talk about in a little bit is as many of you are probably familiar with, methane from oil and gas systems related to fracking and other things. There's some new science on that, and so how do we integrate some of this new science in there without having to basically redo the entire guidelines? And so the decision was, also for some resource constraint reasons and timing reasons, to do what was determined to be called a refinement. So it does not replace the 2006 guidelines. It is to be used in conjunction. We already had a process for errata in the 2006 guidelines, but we're starting to build up more and more erratas, or sort of supplements. None of them all were errors, some of them were updates, and to the point where it's like, it was getting cumbersome to just keep producing all these little errata updates. So this was to be a more systematic way of doing that. Next slide. So just a little background. We had a lot of different scientists and experts worked on this refinement with broad participation from all over the world, developed and developing countries, and a pretty intensive, if you're familiar with IPCC review process, is a pretty intensive review process of multiple stages, including government review and expert review and public review. So it's let's just say well vetted, and a lot of time and energy over couple years went into developing it. Next slide. And then, yeah, it's recently adopted, just May of last year. So the structure of the refinement is the same as the structure of the 2006 guidelines. It just, it has a volume 1, which kind of gives how do you do an inventory, some guidance on how do you think about quality management and issues like that. And then it goes sector by sector in terms of the guidance. One of the things that changed in the 2006 and was retained in the refinement was AFLU, so agriculture, forestry, and land use is combined into one big sector, although in practice, a lot of times those of us doing inventories still separate out the work. We have agricultural work and we have forestry and land use work, but it's combined in one chapter because there's a lot of linkages in terms of how land is used and transferred and the various GHG fluxes that happen with that. So it's an integrated chapter for that reason. And then a key point that some people aren't aware of is the way we think about energy industrial processes. Energy is everything related to energy. So even if it's an industrial process using energy, it's in energy. If it's an industrial process that's not, that's producing greenhouse gas emissions, but it's not related to the use or production of energy, then it's in volume 3 industrial processes. So if you're looking for, how to estimate emissions from steel production, you'll have to actually go to both the energy volume for the energy, elements of steel production, so the energy consumption use, and then the volume 3 for the non-energy aspects of steel production related to, coking coal and things like that that are used for carbon feedstocks. Next slide. So the overview of the refinement was, a lot of little detailed updates, a lot of, emission factors here and there were updated, different parameters updated. We've added some examples where we had gotten feedback over the years that some more kind of clarifications was useful. We tried to clean up kind of the rationale for some of the decisions, because in the guidelines, obviously it's well referenced and based on the existing scientific literature, but there are numerous places where it's expert judgment based. So it's the authors of the guidelines making expert judgment of like, this is how it should be done, or this is the right, kind of mean value to use, again, based on expert judgment. And so justify more information justifying those judgments is included. And then in a couple places, some new Excel-based tools for doing some of the cross-cutting estimations like key category analysis and uncertainty analysis are provided. Next slide. So some of the highlights, and then we're gonna fly through some of the sectors to save time. Because you'll get these slides afterwards to dive into more of the details, and there's a handout as well that gives a lot of details that you'll see hopefully on the side of your screen. But one, what we call the introductory cross-cutting chapter, so volume 1 of the guidelines, one of the things that I think is most valuable coming out of the refinement, and I'm biased because I was one of the authors of it, is new guidance. So this is entirely new guidance on developing inventory management systems. So we say in the kind of the international space, institutional arrangements. So basically, how do you build the teams? How do you build the tools? How do you build the institutional processes for doing inventories? And what are all those pieces and all the things you need to think about, all the staffing and resources and tools, again, and data management, arrangements and quality management arrangements that you need to have in place, and what do those look like? And it provides you some templates and tools for how to start setting those up. And again, they're focused on the national inventory, but they would be just as relevant and useful for subnational levels. Some more guidance on how do you develop your own country-specific emission factors. Some specific guidance for countries that have started collecting facility level data, again, because they're working toward or have a emissions trading system or other mandatory reporting system. So how do you integrate that into a larger scale inventory? And then some other technical guidance on more complex methods and whatnot. Next slide. So now we're just going to fly through a few things. Again, there's some work on how do you verify your inventories with atmospheric measurements. How do you, indirect CO2? I'll let you read about that if you want. That's a topic about what happens to methane and other organic compounds. Once they get in the atmosphere, they could basically convert to CO2, and how do you account for that? And then a perennial challenge, which is how do you think about how do you apply uncertainty analysis? Next slide. And then in all the sectors, again, I mentioned there's a lot of work on fugitive methane and CO2. Next slide. Some obscure industrial process is largely about some obscure categories where we're trying to make sure we're really complete and capturing everything. Some specific new tools on HFCs from refrigerants, but again, very detailed, specific updates. Next slide. On AFLU, a lot of small tweaks and updates and factor improvements. Too many to go through, but I encourage you to take a look at the handout. Next slide. And then on waste, actually the waste had probably was the fewest updates. It's just again a few factor updates, and then a little bit more on gasification issues was really all that happened in that sector. And then lastly, that's basically all I have. We can go to the next slide now, because I'll give you the website to get some of this information. And then that's that. Hopefully, it looks like the website address got cut off on you, but if you basically just put into any search engine IPCC guidelines, it'll pop up pretty much immediately, so it's not hard to find. And then the website looks like this, and you'll see right at the top the refinement is up there. Just a last parting comment, which I'm somewhat sad to make, is the way the refinement is structured is that it only provides the updates and kind of small changes to each volume, and it puts a little bit of the contextual language from the original guidelines from 2006 in the within the refinement document. But unfortunately, it's not again, as I said, it's not a wholesale replacement of the 2006 guidelines. So in practice, for those of us doing this work, you have to have both guidelines open effectively at the same time. You got to have the 2006 guidelines open, and then the 2019 refinement open, and then go to the 2006 for the basic guidance, and then just go to refinement for all these changes. So in a sense, it's like a giant errata. I won't go into the long story about how we ended up there. Let's just say some of us didn't think that was the ideal way to present the information, but that's the way we ended up. And so from just a user-friendly standpoint, it is, I'll admit, it is a little bit of a, let's just say, a pain to use, but it's still, from a technical standpoint, it's a really useful resource, and I encourage everyone, especially if you're interested in particular source categories, because that's your area of focus, to look at the refinement. And even if you're just more of a generalist, then of course it's a good resource, and looking at those changes to volume 1 on how do you do inventories, I think is worth your time. And with that, I will stop.